The wind howled across the desolate plains, a raw, unforgiving sound that scraped at the fragile walls of the small ranch house. Inside, Alara sat wrapped in a threadbare blanket, the fire in the hearth doing little to stave off the bone-deep cold that permeated the very stone and timber. Outside, the land lay shrouded in a heavy, early winter snow, swallowing the fences, blurring the lines between earth and sky. It had been 5 months since Silas had been taken by the fever, 5 months of silence that pressed in on her from all sides, louder than any storm. The cattle were dwindling, the creditors circling like vultures on the horizon, and hope felt like a distant, mocking memory she could no longer grasp. Each sunrise was a fresh burden, a vast, empty day stretching before her, filled only with the ghosts of what had been and the gnawing certainty of what would be. Failure, foreclosure, loneliness that would surely consume her. She was a woman alone on too much land, with too little strength and even less will. Despair was a physical weight, pinning her to the chair, slowing her breath. She had thought of simply walking out into the snow, letting the prairie reclaim her, but some stubborn, weary part of her clung to the phantom of Silas's legacy, a legacy she was proving utterly incapable of upholding. The isolation was absolute. The nearest neighbor was miles away, a day's ride through rough country. The world felt vast and indifferent, and she, a tiny, irrelevant speck against its brutal expanse. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind, letting it carry away the last vestiges of her resolve. Felt peaceful in a way to surrender. The creak of the porch steps shattered the fragile peace. Then, a tentative, muffled knock echoed through the small house. It was a sound so unexpected, so alien to the deep silence that had become her companion, that Alara froze. No one came here anymore, not since Silas, not in this weather. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Curiosity, sharp and sudden, cut through the haze of her despair. Rising stiffly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, she moved towards the door, every instinct screaming caution. The cold air hit her face as she unlatched it, a gust of snow swirling into the entryway. Standing on the small porch, hunched against the wind, was not a neighbor, not a creditor, but a boy. He looked no older than 10, perhaps 11, small for his age, bundled in clothes that were too big and offered poor protection against the biting wind. His face was smudged with dirt, eyes wide and dark in the dim light, fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He held a worn, tied bundle in one hand. He shivered, not violently, but a constant tremor that spoke of deep cold and weariness. He didn't speak immediately, just stared, assessing her with a gaze that seemed far too old for his young face. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind's mournful cry. Alara waited, her own breath held tight in her chest. Who was he? How had he gotten here? The questions tumbled in her mind, but she couldn't voice them. Finally, his lips parted, the words low, raspy, barely audible above the gale. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a fragile thread. I ain't got no 1 inch." He shifted his weight, his gaze unwavering. The simple statement hung in the frigid air, heavy with untold history and desperate need. He took a small, hesitant step forward. Could you be my mother?" The words were simple, direct, impossibly audacious. They struck Alara with the force of a physical blow, scattering her despair, replacing it with a different kind of shock, a confusing swirl of disbelief, fear, and a tiny, unwelcome spark of something she couldn't name. The audacity of the request should have made Alara slam the door, to dismiss the ragged boy as a stray, a potential burden she absolutely could not afford. Her rational mind screamed for her to send him away, back into the storm he'd emerged from. She had nothing to give. She was barely surviving herself. She was broken, empty, a vessel designed for loss. But his eyes, dark and steady, held no childish naivete, only a quiet, desperate plea that mirrored her own silent desolation. He didn't ask for food or shelter, though he clearly needed both. He asked for something immeasurably larger, something she thought she no longer possessed the capacity to give. A mother. The word felt foreign on his young lips, a cruel jest in the face of her own barrenness. Hesitantly, she stepped back, opening the door wider, an unspoken invitation she instantly regretted even as she offered it. He shuffled inside, bringing with him the scent of snow and the cold, damp earth. He stood just inside the threshold, clutching his bundle, his gaze sweeping over the room with a silent, assessing intensity. Alara closed the door against the wind, the sudden quiet amplifying the awkwardness of their shared space. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Caleb," he replied, his voice still low, lacking the bright resonance of a child's. He didn't offer a last name, and she didn't press. Where had he come from? "Just walking," he said, as if that explained everything. Didn't. How long had he been walking? Days? Weeks? The silence descended again, thick with unspoken questions and weary resignation. Alara gestured vaguely towards the fire. "You're cold. Come closer." He hesitated for a moment, then moved towards the hearth, holding out his small, chapped hands to the meager warmth. He didn't chatter, didn't ask questions, simply absorbed the heat with a quiet intensity that suggested a deep, ingrained self-sufficiency. Alara watched him, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. He was too quiet, too contained for a boy his age. Where were his parents? What had happened to him? She didn't ask. Some things felt too fragile to probe, too dangerous to disturb. She made him a bowl of stew, the last of it, watching as he ate slowly, methodically, without eagerness but with a profound lack of waste. He didn't thank her, but there was a subtle deference in the way he handled the bowl, a quiet respect that felt more genuine than any spoken gratitude. She showed him to the small, unused room that had been Silas's study before he'd moved his things to the main living area. It was cold and smelled of dust and old paper. "There's blankets," she said, her voice flat. "You can sleep here," he nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before dropping away. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, the formality surprising. It was the first time he'd acknowledged her presence with anything beyond his initial request and simple answers. Leaving him alone in the small room, Alara returned to the hearth, the silence now different. It wasn't just her own emptiness echoing. It was a shared silence, a quiet weight in the house. She lay awake that night, listening to the wind, but also listening for any sound from the next room. There was none. He was either a remarkably sound sleeper or accustomed to making no noise at all. Doubt gnawed at her. Was this a mistake? Could she truly take on this responsibility when she was failing at her own? The ranch needed work, hard, back-breaking work she no longer had the strength for alone. The debts loomed. The neighbors would talk, condemn her for taking in a stray, a potential thief or troublemaker. Yet, when the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, she found Caleb already awake, standing by the back door, looking out at the snow-covered corrals. He turned as she entered the room, his expression unreadable. Is there work I can do?" he asked, the question quiet, practical, devoid of any expectation of refusal. It was not the question of a child seeking comfort, but of a small, weary adult seeking purpose. Caleb's presence was a quiet disruption, a pebble dropped into the stagnant pool of Alara's grief. He worked tirelessly, without complaint, his small hands surprisingly capable with rough chores. He mended a broken fence post Silas had left unfinished, chopped firewood with a focused determination, and fed the few remaining cattle with a gentle patience that surprised her. He moved through the days with a silent efficiency, never demanding attention, never asking for more than the basic necessities. Dialogue remained sparse, exchanges limited to instructions or simple observations about the weather or the livestock. Yet, through their shared work, a tentative understanding began to form. Alara watched him, observing his quiet resilience, his stoic acceptance of hardship that felt eerily familiar. He never spoke of his past, and she learned not to ask, sensing a deep, protected wound she had no right to probe. His request to be her mother was never repeated, hanging unspoken between them, a ghost of vulnerability he had shown only once. As the weeks passed, the harsh prairie winter tightened its grip. A deep freeze settled over the land, testing the limits of their meager resources. The pipes froze, the wind chill became brutal, and the snow piled higher, threatening to isolate them completely. The cattle huddled together, their breath misting in the frigid air, their ribs showing beneath their hides. Alara felt the familiar vice of despair tightening its grip. This was it, she thought. The end. She couldn't fight the elements and the debt and the crushing loneliness any longer. One morning, she found Caleb outside the barn before dawn, trying to reinforce a section of the structure the wind was threatening to tear apart. His small body was hunched against the gale, his movements slow with cold, but he didn't stop. He simply kept working, methodically, silently. Watching him, something shifted within Alara. It wasn't hope, not yet, but a flicker of fierce protectiveness, a sudden, visceral refusal to let this boy, this silent, resilient creature, face the harshness alone. He had asked for a mother. Perhaps, in his quiet need, he had offered her a reason to stand, a reason to fight. That same week, a rider appeared on the horizon, a smudge against the white landscape. As he drew closer, Alara recognized him. Jedediah Creek, a local rancher known for his shrewdness and his covetous eye for neighboring land. He dismounted heavily, his breath pluming in the cold air, his gaze sweeping over the ranch with incalculating air. "Alara," he greeted, his voice hearty, lacking warmth. "Heard you've been having a tough time of it." It wasn't a statement of sympathy, but a predatory assessment. He glanced towards the barn where Caleb was working, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Didn't know you had help." Alara felt a defensive surge. "He's staying with me," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Jedediah chuckled. A low, unpleasant sound. "A stray, is he?" "You're in no position to be taking in strays, Alara." "Not with the state of things," he gestured vaguely around the property. "I've been thinking," he continued, his tone shifting, becoming patronizingly reasonable. "This land is a lot for a woman alone, especially now." Silas was a good man, but he let the implication hang in the air. "I could make you an offer. Fair offer. Take the burden off your shoulders." The offer was insulting, the implied threat clear. He saw her vulnerability, saw the boy as another sign of her desperation, and was moving in for the kill. But as Alara looked past him, towards the barn, she saw Caleb straighten up, his small figure silhouetted against the weathered wood. His gaze fixed on the visitor with an intensity that held no childish fear, only a quiet, watchful stillness. He wasn't a burden. He was something else. The predator's grin on Jedediah Creek's face widened as he waited for her reply, expecting capitulation, tears, or weak protestations. But Alara felt a strange calmness settle over her. The sheer nerve of him, coming here, in this weather, to circle like a buzzard over Silas's grave, stirred a flicker of fire she thought had long been extinguished. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about dignity, about defying the narrative of collapse he so clearly expected. And it was about the quiet presence behind her, the boy who had asked for a mother and, in doing so, had inadvertently given her a fragile hold on life. "Mr. Creek," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the wind. "This land belonged to my husband, and now it belongs to me." She met his gaze directly, refusing to flinch. "It is not for sale." His eyes narrowed, the friendly veneer cracking. "You're being foolish, Alara. You can't manage this alone." "I'm not alone," she replied, glancing towards the barn. Caleb was still there, watching, a small, still point of unwavering attention. Jedediah followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "That boy? He's a mouth to feed, not a hired hand. You're drowning, Alara. Don't be stubborn. Get off my property, Jedediah," she said, her voice gaining strength. Now he stared at her for another long moment, clearly surprised by her defiance. The wind whipped around them, carrying snow that stung their faces. He seemed to weigh the possibility of pressing the issue, but something in her stance, in the unexpected steel in her eyes, must have warned him off. With a curt nod that was more a dismissal than a sign of respect, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back the way he came, disappearing into the swirling snow. Alara watched him go, her body trembling slightly, but not from cold. It was the echo of fear, quickly replaced by a quiet surge of something else. Pride. She had stood her ground. Turning, she walked towards the barn. Caleb was still by the damaged wall, inspecting the timbers. He didn't look up as she approached. "He's gone," she stated simply. "I know," he replied, his voice flat. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. There was no judgment in them, only a quiet understanding. He didn't ask what had been said, didn't pry into her decision. He simply accepted it, accepted her. It was a moment of silent communion, deeper than any conversation. In that quiet space, the unspoken request from the doorstep seemed to echo, no longer a question of him asking for something, but of them finding something together. The winter was long and brutal. They faced frozen pumps, dwindling feed, the constant battle against the elements. There were days when Alara felt the despair creeping back in, whispering its familiar lies. But each time, she looked at Caleb, saw his quiet determination, his small frame battling the snow or fixing a loose board, and found a reason to keep going. He wasn't Silas, and she was still a widow, still carried the weight of her loss. But she was also something new. She was a woman with a purpose beyond mere survival. A woman with a quiet, unexpected companion who shared her struggle, who relied on her, and in doing so, made her stronger. They worked side by side, two silent figures against the vast, white landscape, their movements synchronized by necessity and a growing, wordless bond. The ranch was still precarious, the future uncertain. But it was theirs, and together they faced it one difficult day at a time. The spring finally came, hesitant at first, then with a rush of melting snow and green shoots pushing through the thawing earth. The land, which had seemed so cruel and barren, began to stir with life. And Alara, standing on the porch in the warmer air, watching Caleb mend a fence, felt a different kind of stirring within herself. Hope was not a grand, blinding light, but a quiet, persistent warmth, like the sun on her face after a long winter. It had not been found in forgetting, or in replacing what was lost, but in building something new, something unexpected, from the ruins. Resilience, she realized, wasn't about weathering the storm alone. It was about finding the quiet strength to open the door, even when you thought you had nothing left, and discovering that sometimes the most profound connections, the most unexpected forms of family, arrive on your doorstep, asking for a mother and teaching you how to live again.